In the year 1243, in the small market town of Ashford in Kent, a master mason named Edwin spent his days coaxing beauty from limestone and chalk. At 41 years old, with dusk-grayed hair and calloused, steady hands, he had carved decorative work for 3 parish churches, and his reputation for patience had grown as firm as the stone he shaped. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to a mason's workshop in medieval England, where we will follow Edwin through the unhurried rhythm of his craft. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. The morning had arrived with mist clinging to the cobbled streets, softening the edges of timber-framed buildings and wrapping the town in hushed stillness. Edwin stood in his workshop, a modest stone structure behind his home, where the air held the mineral scent of limestone dust and the faint sweetness of linseed oil. Pale light filtered through the open doorway, illuminating countless motes that drifted lazy and unhurried through the space. The coolness of the autumn air settled pleasantly against his skin, a gentle reminder that summer's warmth had given way to something more temperate, more forgiving of long hours spent in concentration. His hands rested on a block of Caen stone that had arrived by cart 3 days prior, its surface still bearing the rough marks of the quarry. The limestone was pale as cream, fine-grained and dense, perfect for the decorative capitals he had been commissioned to carve for the New Lady Chapel at St. Mary's. Edwin had spent yesterday afternoon simply looking at the stone, walking around it, letting his fingers trace the subtle variations in its texture. This was his wane ever rushing toward the first cut, but rather listening to what the stone itself might suggest. The workshop smelled of old wood and fresh shavings, of iron tools oiled against rust, and underneath it all, the clean mineral breath of raw stone. A small brazier in the corner held embers from the previous evening, their faint warmth taking the edge off the morning chill. Edwin moved toward it, adding a few pieces of charcoal, watching as thin wisps of smoke curled upward and vanished into the rafters. The motion required no thought. His body knew these rhythms after 26 years of working stone. When the fire had settled into a comfortable glow, he returned to the workbench where his tools waited in their accustomed places. Chisels of varying widths hung from wooden pegs, their edges recently sharpened, catching the morning light in thin, bright lines. Mallets of different weights rested in a row, their handles worn smooth by countless hours in his grip. A set of calipers lay beside a wooden template he had carved weeks ago, its curves representing the acanthus leaves he would soon coax from the limestone surface. Edwin lifted a medium-weight mallet, feeling its familiar balance in his palm. The handle had darkened over the years from the oil of his skin, had conformed to the shape of his grasp until tool and hand seemed made for one another. He selected a broad chisel for the initial work, one that would remove larger portions of excess stone, and carried both tools to where the limestone block waited on its wooden support. The first tap was always the gentlest greeting between metal and stone, a way of understanding the material's density and character. The sound that returned was clean and clear, promising good work ahead. Edwin allowed himself a small smile, that private expression of satisfaction that came from recognizing quality in raw materials. Stone could be temperamental, full of hidden flaws or unexpected weaknesses, but this piece felt solid, dependable, worthy of the time he would spend shaping it. Hours drifted past as Edwin worked, removing broad sections of stone that would never be part of the final form. The rhythm of mallet against chisel became a kind of meditation, each strike measured and deliberate, neither hurried nor hesitant. Limestone dust gathered on his leather apron, dusted his forearms, settled into the creases of his knuckles. The scent of it filled his nose, familiar as bread baking or rain on thatch, the smell of his livelihood, his purpose, his days. By the time the church bells rang for a long time, marking mid-morning, Edwin had established the basic proportions of the capital. The block had begun to suggest its eventual form, though to an untrained eye it might still appear rough and unfinished. He stepped back, wiping dust from his brow with the back of his hand, and studied what he had accomplished. The morning light had shifted, now entering at a steeper angle, illuminating the fresh cuts with clarity that revealed every mark of his chisel. Satisfied with the morning's progress, Edwin set down his tools and moved to the doorway. The mist had burned away, leaving the day clear and mild, with high clouds drifting slow and peaceful across a pale sky. The workshop opened onto a small courtyard where his wife, Beatrice, kept an herb garden. The scent of rosemary and thyme drifted on the light breeze, mingling with the sharper smell of wood smoke from neighboring hearths. Beatrice appeared from the kitchen with a wooden cup of small beer and a wedge of cheese wrapped in clean linen. At 39 years old, with capable, flour-dusted hands and brown hair bound under her linen coif, she had the same unhurried manner that characterized her husband's work. She handed him the cup without words, their long companionship requiring little speech for such familiar exchanges. Edwin drank deeply, the beer cool and slightly tart, washing limestone dust from his throat. They sat together on the wooden bench outside the workshop, sharing the cheese in comfortable silence. A neighbor's cat, a gray tabby with white paws, picked its way across the courtyard and paused to regard them with amber eyes before continuing its patrol. Somewhere nearby, a woman sang as she worked, her voice carrying fragments of a melody too distant to identify but pleasant in its casual musicality. The sun had climbed higher, its warmth beginning to penetrate the autumn coolness, bringing with it a drowsy contentment that settled over the courtyard like a blanket. Edwin returned to the workshop as the bells for sext rang out across the town, their bronze voices layering over one another in cascading harmonies that had marked the hours for as long as anyone could remember. The limestone waited exactly as he had left it, patient and unchanged, ready to receive whatever form his hands would give it. He ran his fingers along the roughed-out shape, feeling where the stone's surface shifted from smooth quarry cut to freshly worked texture, reading the progress of the morning through touch as much as sight. The afternoon work required finer tools. Edwin selected a narrow chisel, one designed for detail rather than bulk removal, and a lighter mallet whose head had been shaped from dense applewood. The combination allowed for greater precision, for cuts measured in fractions of an inch rather than broad strokes. He had learned this progression from his master, old William of Canterbury, who had taught him that stone revealed itself gradually, that rushing toward the final form only led to mistakes that could not be undone. As he positioned the chisel against the stone, Edwin found himself humming not consciously, but in the way that happened when his mind settled fully into the work. The melody was a fragment of plain chant he had heard at Sunday Mass, a slow, meandering line that seemed to match the unhurried pace of his chisel's progress. Each tap of the mallet sent a small chip of limestone spinning away, revealing the paler, finer stone beneath. The dust caught the afternoon light, creating momentary constellations that appeared and vanished in the space between one breath and the next. The capital he was shaping would feature acanthus leaves, those elegant curling forms that had adorned architecture since time beyond memory. Edwin had carved them hundreds of times, yet each iteration felt new, requiring the same careful attention to the way leaves curved and overlapped, the way light would eventually play across their surfaces when the capital stood 30 feet above the chapel floor. His template guided the general proportions, but the specific character of each leaf the exact depth of an undercut. The precise curve of a stem emerged from the dialogue between his hands and the stone itself. By the time shadows began lengthening across the courtyard, Edwin had completed the first of 4 large leaves that would form the capitol's primary decoration. He stepped back, tilting his head to examine the work from different angles, allowing the raking light to reveal any inconsistencies in depth or smoothness. The leaf seemed to emerge from the stone's surface with a gentle dimensionality, neither too bold nor too timid, catching light and shadow in equal measure. The workshop had grown noticeably cooler as the afternoon waned. Edwin added more charcoal to the brazier, then busied himself with the careful task of cleaning his tools. Each chisel received a tension wiped clean of dust, examined for any chips or damage to the cutting edge, returned to its designated place on the wall. The mallets were brushed free of stone powder and hung by their leather thongs. This ritual of tool maintenance carried its own satisfaction, the knowledge that tomorrow's work would begin with everything prepared and ready. When the last tool had been tended, Edwin swept the day's accumulation of stone chips and dust into a wooden bucket. The limestone powder would eventually be mixed with water and used for whitewashing walls or filling small gaps in masonry. Nothing in his trade went to waste, even the smallest fragments found purpose. The rhythmic whisper of the broom against the flagstone floor created a soothing conclusion to the day's labor, a final act of ordering before he released himself from the workshop's demands. Beatrice had prepared a simple supper of pottage, barley, and vegetables simmered slowly through the afternoon until they had softened into comfortable harmony. The earthenware bowls steamed as she ladled out generous portions, the scent of leeks and turnips rising with the heat. They ate at the wooden table in their modest hall, the room warmed by a hearth fire that crackled and popped as pockets of moisture in the logs found the flames. Tallow candles provided additional light, their flames steady and golden in the still air. Their conversation moved easily between comfortable silences and gentle observations about the day. Beatrice mentioned that their daughter, Alice, who worked as a seamstress 3 houses down the street, had completed a fine altar cloth for the parish church. Edwin spoke of the stone's quality, how it cut cleanly without crumbling, how the limestone's tight grain would hold detail for generations. Neither felt the need to fill every moment with words. Their marriage, 16 years established, had taught them the value of quietness shared. After supper, Edwin stepped outside into the deepening dusk. The sky had taken on that particular blue that arrives between day and night, neither one nor the other, but something distinct and transitory. A few early stars had appeared, pinpricks of light in the darkening expanse. The air held an edge of coolness now, hinting at the frost that would arrive in earnest when autumn gave way to winter. He could hear distant voices from the market square, where the day's final transactions were being completed before darkness made commerce impractical. The parish church of St. Edmund stood silhouetted against the twilight sky, its square tower solid and reassuring. Edwin had repaired sections of its exterior stonework 2 years prior, replacing weathered blocks with fresh limestone that would eventually age to match the original. He felt a quiet pride in such work, knowing that his hands had contributed to the town's permanent landscape, that his labor would outlast him by centuries. He made his way back inside, where Beatrice had already banked the fire for the night, covering the embers with ash to preserve their heat until morning. The household's simple routines unfolded without need for discussion, water fetched for washing, the door secured, candles extinguished except for the single rushlight that would burn through the night's dark hours. Edwin climbed the narrow stairs to the sleeping loft, where their bed waited with its mattress of wool and straw, covered in heavy woolen blankets woven in subtle patterns of brown and cream. Sleep came easily, as it always did after a day of physical labor. The deep contentment that characterized Edwin's waking hours followed him into rest, carrying no tension or worry, only the satisfying weight of muscles well used, and the knowledge that tomorrow would bring more of the same purposeful work. The night settled over Ashford, quiet and unhurried, while limestone dust continued its slow descent through the darkness of the workshop, settling like snow that would never melt. Morning arrived with the gradual lightening of the sky, the stars fading one by one until only the brightest remained, and then those too disappeared into the strengthening blue. Edwin woke to the familiar sounds of the town stirring, a rooster's distant crowing, the creak of shutters being opened, the murmur of early conversation from the bakery next door where ovens had been fired before dawn. He dressed in yesterday's work clothes, already bearing the pale marks of limestone dust that would never entirely wash free, and descended to find Beatrice laying out bread and cheese for breaking their fast. The bread was still warm from the baker's oven, its crust crackling under the knife as Edwin cut thick slices. He spread each with a thin layer of honey that Beatrice had traded for with the beekeeper who lived beyond the town walls, where meadows provided forage for his hives. The sweetness complemented the bread's yeasty flavor, and together with the sharp aged cheese, made a meal that required nothing more. They ate standing near the hearth, where embers from the previous night had been coaxed back to flame. The workshop welcomed Edwin back with its familiar scents and shadows, the morning light entering at a slightly different angle than yesterday, marking the sun's slow progression through autumn's arc. The limestone capital waited on its stand, the single completed leaf seeming almost to grow from the stone's surface, its curves catching the pale illumination in ways that made it appear more plant than mineral. Edwin circled the piece slowly, studying it with fresh eyes, confirming that yesterday's judgment had been sound, that the work could continue without revision. He selected his tools for the second leaf, choosing a slightly narrower chisel that would allow for variation in the curling edges. The acanthus pattern required that each leaf possess its own character while maintaining harmony with its neighbors. Too much similarity created monotony. Too much difference destroyed the overall unity. This balance occupied Edwin's thoughts as he positioned the chisel, as his mallet began its measured tapping, as limestone dust once again began its drift through the workshop's still air. The morning passed in this steady rhythm, punctuated only by the bells marking terce and then sext, their bronze voices rolling across rooftops and gardens, through narrow streets and open squares. Edwin worked without breaking, his body moving through familiar patterns, his hands knowing their tasks so thoroughly that conscious thought became unnecessary. Instead, his mind wandered to pleasant considerations: the quality of last year's apple harvest, the way morning mist transformed familiar landscapes into something mysterious yet comfortable, the sound of Beatrice's laughter when their grandson had visited 3 days prior. By midday, the second leaf had emerged, slightly narrower than its companion but equal in depth and detail. The two together began to suggest the capital's eventual appearance, the way the 4 leaves would overlap and interweave, creating patterns of light and shadow that would change throughout the day as the sun moved across the chapel's interior. Edwin set down his tools and stretched, feeling the pleasant ache in his shoulders and forearms that came from sustained work, the kind of tiredness that spoke of effort rather than strain. He stepped into the courtyard, where the day had warmed considerably. The sun stood nearly overhead, casting short shadows that pooled darkly at the base of walls and beneath the herb garden's plants. Beatrice had set out a wooden bowl of water for washing, and Edwin scrubbed his hands and forearms, watching limestone slurry swirl milky white before settling to the bottom. A cloth of rough-woven linen dried his skin, leaving it clean but bearing the inevitable small cuts and calluses that marked a mason's hands as surely as any guild seal. Their midday meal was pottage again, this time enriched with dried peas that had simmered since morning until they surrendered to softness. Chunks of yesterday's bread, too stale for eating plain, had been added to absorb the liquid, creating a thick, nourishing dish that required only a wooden spoon and patience. They ate in the hall, where the fire had been allowed to die down to embers, the day's warmth making additional heat unnecessary. A jug of ale stood on the table, its contents cool from having spent the morning in the shadowed corner where summer's heat never penetrated. After eating, Edwin allowed himself a rare indulgence, a brief rest on the bench outside, his back against the sun-warmed stone of the house wall, his eyes closed against the brightness. Beatrice sat beside him with her mending, her needle moving through a torn seam on one of his work tunics with the same steady rhythm he applied to stone. The sounds of the town filtered into their courtyard, a cart rumbling past on the street beyond, children's voices raised in some game, the intermittent ring of hammer on anvil from the blacksmith's shop 3 buildings distant. The cat appeared again, the gray tabby with white paws, and wound itself around Edwin's ankles before settling in a patch of sunlight near his feet. Its purring created a low, continuous rumble that seemed to resonate with the general contentment of the afternoon. Edwin opened his eyes to slits, watching dust motes drift golden in the air, watching clouds move with deliberate slowness across the blue expanse above. For these moments, time itself seemed to slow, to thicken like honey, making each breath feel longer, each heartbeat more perceptible. The bells for none eventually called him back to awareness, their sound less an interruption than a gentle reminder that the day continued its progression. Edwin rose with the unhurried deliberateness that characterized all his movements, brushed stone dust from his tunic, though fresh dust would soon replace it, and returned to the workshop. The limestone waited as it always did, patient and undemanding, ready to receive whatever attention he chose to give. The afternoon work began with the third leaf, this one positioned to overlap the first in a way that would create depth, making the carved foliage appear to exist in layers rather than as a flat relief. Edwin had learned this technique from studying Roman capitals in Canterbury, where ancient stones still spoke of craftsmanship from ages past. The trick lay in undercutting, carefully removing stone from behind the forward elements, creating shadows that the eye interpreted as space and dimension. This required particular care, as too deep an undercut could weaken the stone, creating fragile sections that might break during carving or, worse, years hence when the capital supported actual weight. Edwin worked slowly, testing frequently with his fingers, feeling for the point where shadow became sufficient without compromise of strength. The chisel's angle had to be precise, the mallet's force carefully judged, each small removal of stone considered before execution. The work absorbed him completely, narrowing his awareness to the few inches where metal met mineral, where intention became form. His breathing slowed and deepened, matching the rhythm of the mallet's strikes. The workshop grew warmer as afternoon sun found the doorway, spilling golden light across the floor, illuminating the drift of limestone dust until it resembled snow falling upward rather than down. The scent of stone filled Edwin's nose and throat, so familiar it had ceased to be noticed, yet so integral to his experience that its absence would have felt wrong, incomplete. When the bells for vespers rang, Edwin straightened and stepped back, rolling his shoulders to ease their stiffness. The third leaf had achieved the depth he sought, its forward edge standing proud of the stone behind, its underside lost in shadow that gave it the appearance of actual vegetation caught mid-growth. He allowed himself the small pleasure of satisfaction, that quiet internal acknowledgement that the work progressed well, that his hands had not forgotten their skill, that the stone had cooperated in revealing the form hidden within its mass. The evening air had cooled noticeably, reminding Edwin that autumn advanced day by day toward winter's arrival. He performed his customary tool cleaning with methodical thoroughness, wiping each implement, checking edges, returning everything to its proper place. The repetition of these actions held its own comfort, the knowledge that tomorrow would begin with order rather than chaos, with preparation rather than neglect. The broom whispered across the floor again, gathering the day's accumulation of chips and powder into tidy piles that he swept into the wooden bucket. Before leaving the workshop, Edwin paused to cover the limestone capital with a dampened cloth. This prevented the stone from drying too quickly, which could cause cracking in partially carved sections where stress had been introduced by the removal of surrounding material. The cloth draped over the emerging leaves like morning mist, softening their forms, making them appear even more plant-like in the workshop's dimming light. He stood for a moment, simply looking, allowing himself to envision the completed work hall, 4 leaves in place, the stone polished smooth, the capital installed high in the Lady Chapel where it would catch morning light through stained glass windows. Supper that evening consisted of fish that Beatrice had purchased from the Friday market, dried cod that she had soaked overnight to remove excess salt, then simmered with onions and herbs until it flaked tender under a wooden spoon. They ate with barley bread and drank ale that had been flavored with meadowsweet, its subtle sweetness complementing the fish's savory richness. The meal unfolded in their customary mixture of conversation and comfortable quiet, neither feeling obligated to fill every moment with words, both content to simply share the space and time. After supper, Edwin walked to the parish church for Compline, the day's final prayer service. The church's interior held the coolness of stone walls that never entirely surrendered to warmth, and the scent of beeswax candles mingled with lingering traces of incense from earlier services. The familiar Latin phrases rose and fell in rhythmic patterns, Father Benedict's voice steady and reassuring, leading the small congregation through prayers that had been offered at this same hour for countless generations. The walk home from church took Edwin past the market square, now empty of merchants and goods, swept clean by the town's beetle in preparation for tomorrow's trading. Moonlight painted the cobblestones silver, transforming the familiar space into something dreamlike and mysterious. A dog trotted past on some nocturnal errand, its nails clicking against stone, and somewhere in the darkness a night bird called, its voice clear and unhurried in the stillness. Inside their home, the fire had been banked once more, its covered embers promising warmth for morning. Beatrice had already retired to the sleeping loft, and Edwin climbed the narrow stairs to find her arranging the woolen blankets, smoothing them with her capable hands. The loft held the day's accumulated warmth, making it noticeably more comfortable than the hall below, where cold air settled during night hours. A single rushlight burned in its holder, casting gentle illumination across rough-hewn beams and whitewashed walls. Edwin settled into bed beside his wife, the straw mattress rustling softly as it accepted his weight. Through the small window, he could see stars scattered across the night sky, their light distant and constant, unchanged from the stars his grandfather had observed, and his grandfather's grandfather before that. The thought brought a sense of continuity that Edwin found deeply restful, this notion that human lives passed like seasons while stars and stone endured, that his work with limestone connected him to masons centuries past and centuries hence. Sleep arrived gradually, like evening becoming night, a gentle transition rather than an abrupt change. Edwin's breathing deepened and slowed, his body releasing the day's accumulated tension, his mind drifting into that peaceful space where thought dissolved into sensation, where awareness faded into rest. The night held him gently, asking nothing, offering only darkness and quiet and the soft sound of Beatrice's breathing beside him. The following morning announced itself with birdsong rather than bells, sparrows and finches greeting the dawn with enthusiasm that seemed excessive for such an early hour. Edwin woke slowly, allowing consciousness to return at its own pace, feeling no urgency to rush into the day. Pale light seeped through the window, gray rather than golden, suggesting clouds had moved in overnight. He dressed and descended to find Beatrice already preparing porridge, the grain simmering in a pot hung over freshly kindled flames. They broke their fast with the hot porridge, sweetened with honey and enriched with a handful of dried berries that Beatrice had preserved from summer's bounty. The warmth of the meal spread through Edwin's chest and belly, preparing him for the day's work. He ate slowly, savoring each spoonful, noticing the interplay of flavors, the earthiness of the grain, the brightness of the berries, the complex sweetness of the honey. This attention to small pleasures had become habitual over years, a way of finding satisfaction in ordinary moments. The workshop greeted him with its cool, mineral-scented air, slightly damp from the moisture that had condensed overnight on stone surfaces. Edwin removed the cloth from the capital, examining yesterday's work in the morning's diffused light. The 3 completed leaves maintained their quality, showing no cracks or unexpected changes. He traced their curves with his fingertips, feeling the smoothness where his tools had traveled, the roughness where additional work remained. Today he would complete the 4th and final leaf, then begin the detailed work of refining surfaces, adjusting depths, ensuring that all 4 elements work together in a harmonious relationship. This final stage required patience even beyond what had come before, as the temptation to rush toward completion grew stronger as the end approached. Edwin had learned to resist this urge, to maintain his steady pace regardless of proximity to finish, knowing that haste revealed itself in the work, that shortcuts announced themselves to discerning eyes. He selected his finest chisels for this stage, tools with edges honed to exceptional sharpness, capable of removing stone in layers thin as parchment. The mallet he chose was the lightest in his collection, its applewood head barely larger than his fist, designed for delicate work where control mattered more than force. These tools felt almost weightless in his hands after days of working with heavier implements, and he took a moment to adjust to their different balance before beginning. The 4th leaf took shape with the same deliberate care as its predecessors, its proportions measured against the wooden template, its curves harmonizing with the established pattern. Edwin worked with complete focus, his world narrowing to the small space where chisel met stone, where possibility became actuality. The sound of metal on limestone created a gentle percussion, neither loud nor harsh, merely present a patient tapping that marked time without dominating it. By the hour of terse, the 4th leaf existed in rough form, its basic shape established, its position relative to the others determined. Edwin paused to drink from the water jug he kept in the workshop, the liquid cool and clean, washing limestone dust from his throat. He stretched his arms above his head, feeling vertebrae shift and settle, feeling muscles lengthen after their sustained contraction. Through the open doorway, he watched clouds move across the gray sky, their edges occasionally brightening where hidden sun attempted to penetrate their mass. The remainder of the morning Edwin devoted to refinement, moving from leaf to leaf with different chisels, adjusting depths by fractions of an inch smoothing surfaces that would eventually be polished to silk. This work required constant assessment, stepping back to view the whole, moving close to examine details, tilting the stone to catch light from different angles. His eyes had developed over decades the ability to see not just what existed but what needed changing, where a curve required softening, where an edge needed crispness, where shadow pools needed deepening. The bells for sext found him absorbed in perfecting the transition where the fourth leaf overlapped the second, creating a junction that needed to appear natural rather than contrived. Stone dust had settled over his hands and forearms like fine powder, turning his skin pale, filling the creases of his knuckles with white. He barely noticed, his attention wholly captured by the few square inches before him, by the subtle dance of light and shadow across carved surfaces. Beatrice's appearance in the doorway pulled him from his concentration. She carried a wooden bowl containing bread and cheese, and a small ale jug hung from her other hand. Edwin set down his tools with the reluctance of someone called from pleasant dreams, though his body appreciated the interruption, the chance to rest hands and eyes grown weary from sustained precision work. They ate together on the courtyard bench, where thin sunlight had broken through the clouds, creating a patch of warmth that felt precious after the morning's grayness. A neighbor passed along the street beyond their courtyard wall, calling a greeting that Edwin returned with a raised hand. The man was Robert, a carpenter whose shop stood 2 streets distant, and whose work Edwin had collaborated with on several projects over the years. Their crafts intersected frequently, stone and wood combined in doorways and window frames, in altar rails and rude screens. There existed between them an unspoken understanding born of shared experience, the knowledge that both dealt in materials that demanded patience and respect. The afternoon brought clearer skies, the clouds thinning and dispersing until only scattered remnants remained, drifting like sheep across blue pasture. Edwin returned to the workshop with renewed energy, the food and rest having restored what the morning's concentration had depleted. He approached the capital with a fresh perspective, seeing elements that had escaped his notice earlier, small inconsistencies in depth that required attention, edges that needed additional refinement. He worked methodically through each leaf, starting with the first and progressing in order, giving each the same thorough examination and adjustment. The broad chisel had been set aside entirely now, replaced by the finest tools in his collection, implements designed for finishing work, for creating surfaces smooth enough to accept polish. The sounds they made were softer than before, delicate taps rather than assertive strikes, whispers rather than statements. The limestone responded beautifully to this final stage of carving, revealing the full fineness of its grain as Edwin's chisels removed the last rough texture. The stone seemed to glow from within, its pale cream color becoming luminous where surfaces had been worked to near smoothness. Light played across the carved leaves with increasing subtlety, catching in the undercuts, sliding along the curves, creating an interplay of brightness and shadow that gave the static stone an illusion of movement, as though a breeze might at any moment stir the carved foliage. Hours passed in this detailed work, the passage of time marked by the slow shift of sunlight across the workshop floor, by the gradual lowering of sun toward the western horizon, Edwin's hands moved with practiced certainty, requiring no conscious direction, guided by years of experience that had embedded themselves in muscle and nerve. His mind wandered freely while his hands worked, touching on memories of his apprenticeship, of his master's patient instruction, of the first piece he had carved entirely by himself, a simple corbel that still supported a beam in the house where he had grown up. The bells for vespers startled him from these pleasant recollections. Edwin straightened, surprised to find that the afternoon had passed so completely. That evening already approached. The capital before him had transformed during these absorbed hours, its four leaves now fully realized, their surfaces refined to the point where only final polishing remained. He felt a surge of quiet satisfaction, that deep contentment that came not from pride but from work executed well, from potential fulfilled through steady application of skill and care. He cleaned his tools with particular thoroughness, knowing that tomorrow would bring different work, the polishing that would complete the capital, followed by the beginning of a new project, a series of decorative bosses for the church's nave ceiling. Each tool received individual attention, each edge examined under the waning light, each handle wiped free of the day's accumulated dust and oil. The ritual had become meditation, a way of transitioning from work's intensity to evening's gentler rhythms. Before covering the capital for the night, Edwin dampened a cloth in water and carefully wiped the stone's surfaces, removing the finest dust that might otherwise work into the grain and dull the finish. The wet stone revealed its true color, darker and richer than when dry, showing hints of variation, subtle shifts from cream to pale gold, tiny mineral inclusions that caught light like distant stars. These small imperfections gave the limestone character, distinguished it from the uniform blandness of lesser materials. Supper that evening was a thick vegetable pottage, made hearty with pearl barley and flavored with herbs from Beatrice's garden, sage and thyme, their earthy flavors complementing the root vegetables that had simmered until they surrendered entirely to softness. Chunks of bread, torn rather than cut, were used to soak up the rich liquid, each bite carrying warmth that spread through Edwin's chest. They ate by firelight, the day having faded entirely to darkness while he completed his workshop tasks. Their conversation turned to practical matters, the need to purchase additional charcoal before winter's cold made the brazier essential rather than merely comfortable, the repairs that their daughter Alice's cottage would require before heavy rains arrived, the news that Father Benedict had shared after Mass regarding the bishop's planned visit in spring. These topics required no urgency, no immediate decision, but simply offered substance for companionable exchange, thoughts shared in the easy manner of long partnership. After supper, Edwin sat by the fire with a cup of warmed ale, watching flames dance and shift, finding patterns in their movement that appeared and dissolved before his eyes could fully register them. His body carried the pleasant heaviness that came from a day of physical labor, muscles relaxed and loose, mind emptied of its earlier focus. Beatrice settled beside him with her spindle, the wool flowing through her fingers with the same steady rhythm that characterized all her movements, transforming fleece into yarn through patient repetition. The fire's warmth made him drowsy, his eyelids growing heavy, his breathing deepening. He allowed himself to drift in that comfortable space between waking and sleep, where thoughts became dreamlike and indistinct, where the boundaries between consciousness and rest blurred and softened. The crackling of flames, the gentle whir of Beatrice's spindle, the settling of embers in the hearth, these sounds wove together into a lullaby that asked nothing except surrender to the approaching night. Eventually Beatrice touched his arm, her gesture gentle, and together they climbed the stairs to the sleeping loft. The routine of preparing for bed unfolded with familiar ease, clothing removed and folded, the rushlight extinguished, the woolen blankets arranged for maximum warmth. Edwin settled into the mattress, feeling it conform to his body's contours, and reached out to take Beatrice's hand in his own, a small gesture of connection and affection that required no words. Through the window, stars had emerged in countless numbers, their cold light undiminished by the distance it had traveled to reach this small English town. Edwin watched them for a brief moment before closing his eyes, thinking how the same stars had witnessed the quarrying of the limestone he worked, had shone on the Roman masons whose techniques he still employed, would shine on craftsmen not yet born who would someday repair what he now created. The thought brought neither sadness nor anxiety, only a sense of belonging to something larger and longer than his individual life. Sleep arrived like a tide coming in, gradual and inevitable, carrying him gently away from the day's events into darkness and rest. His last conscious awareness was of warmth, the blankets holding heat, Beatrice's presence beside him, the lingering sense of work well done that glowed quietly in his chest like banked embers. Then even this faded, and he drifted into the deep, peaceful sleep of one who has lived the day fully and found it good. Morning returned with its customary sounds and sensations, the gradual lightening beyond the window, the distant crow of roosters, the stirring of the town as shutters opened and doors creaked on leather hinges. Edwin woke feeling thoroughly rested, his body refreshed, his mind clear and ready for the day's final work on the capital. He dressed and descended to find porridge already prepared, its steam rising in gentle spirals, its scent promising warmth and sustenance. The porridge bowl warmed Edwin's palms as he held it, the heat seeping into his calloused fingers with pleasant intensity. He ate standing near the hearth, where the fire's glow provided both light and comfort against the morning's chill. Through the small window, he could see frost sparkling on the courtyard's flagstones, the first true frost of the season, transforming familiar surfaces into something glittering and strange. The sight brought no concern, only quiet acknowledgement that the year had turned another corner, that winter approached with its own particular rhythms and demands. Beatrice joined him with her own bowl, and they ate in companionable silence, sharing the space without need for conversation. The grain's warmth spread through Edwin's body, preparing him for the transition from the house's relative comfort to the workshop's colder air. He savored the last spoonfuls, noticing how the honey had settled to the bottom, creating a final taste of concentrated sweetness that lingered pleasantly on his tongue. The workshop received him with its mineral breath, the air noticeably colder than previous mornings, sharp enough to make his first inhalations feel crisp and clarifying. Edwin stirred the brazier's embers and added fresh charcoal, coaxing them back to life with patient attention. Small flames appeared, hesitant at first, then growing bolder as they found purchase in the new fuel. The warmth they provided would take time to spread through the space, but their presence alone made the workshop feel less austere, more welcoming. He uncovered the capital and studied it in the morning's clear light, which entered the doorway at a low angle, emphasizing every surface variation. The carving had reached the stage where only polishing remained, that final transformation that would take the stone from merely well carved to genuinely beautiful. This work required different tools, entirely not chisels and mallets, but smoothing stones of varying grades, each progressively finer than the last, capable of removing smaller and smaller irregularities until the limestone surface achieved a lustrous smoothness. Edwin began with the coarsest smoothing stone, a piece of sandstone that felt rough against his fingertips, its surface composed of countless tiny grains that acted as natural abrasive. He dampened it with water from the jug he kept for this purpose, then began working it across the carved leaves in small circular motions. The friction created a soft, grinding sound, peaceful and rhythmic, like distant surf against a pebbled shore. Limestone dust mixed with water to form a pale slurry that gathered in the carved details, which Edwin periodically wiped away with a damp cloth. The work progressed slowly, requiring complete coverage of every surface, reaching into curves and undercuts, ensuring that no area remained rougher than its neighbors. Edwin's hands knew the proper pressure, the correct angle, the ideal speed of movement, knowledge acquired through thousands of hours of similar work, embedded so deeply that conscious thought played no role. His mind drifted while his hands labored, touching on pleasant considerations without settling on any single thought for long. By the time the bells rang for terce, he had completed the initial smoothing of all 4 leaves. The capital's appearance had changed subtly but significantly, the stone's surface now possessing a faint sheen, where the coarse abrasive had removed the chisel's marks. Edwin set aside the sandstone and selected the next grade of smoothing tool, this one made from finer-grained material, its surface less obviously rough but still possessing sufficient texture to continue the refinement process. The second stage of polishing proceeded with the same methodical thoroughness as the first, Edwin working section by section, leaf by leaf, ensuring uniformity of finish. The sound the finer stone made was softer, less grinding and more whispering, a susurration that filled the workshop with its gentle presence. Water and limestone dust continued their mixing and removal, the rhythm of work and cleaning becoming almost meditative in its repetition. The morning passed in this absorbed labor, time marked by bells and by the sun's movement across the sky, its light slowly climbing the workshop's eastern wall as it rose toward its midday height. Edwin felt no impatience, no desire to rush toward completion, only the steady satisfaction of work unfolding at its proper pace. His shoulders and arms began to carry the pleasant ache of sustained effort, muscles working in familiar patterns, finding their own endurance in the task's requirements. When Beatrice appeared with the midday meal, Edwin had progressed to the finest smoothing stone in his collection, a piece of dense limestone quarried specifically for this purpose, its surface so smooth it felt almost silken against his palm. This final polishing would bring the capital to its completed state, revealing the full beauty of the carved acanthus leaves, making them appear almost translucent where light penetrated their thinnest sections. They ate bread and cheese in the courtyard, where the sun had climbed high enough to banish the morning's frost, leaving the flagstones dry and faintly warm. The air held the crystalline clarity that often followed cold nights, making distant sounds seem nearer, sharpening the edges of buildings against the blue sky. A flock of starlings passed overhead, their wings creating a rushing sound like wind through rushes, their collective movement creating patterns that shifted and reformed with fluid grace. Edwin noticed the herb garden's transformation under frosts influenced. The tender plants had wilted and darkened, while hardier varieties like rosemary and thyme maintained their green vitality, promising flavor for winter pottages when fresh vegetables grew scarce. This cycle of growth and dormancy, of abundance and scarcity, felt as natural to him as breathing, as fundamental as the stone's patient surrender to his tools. Everything possessed its season, its appropriate time, its place in the larger pattern. The afternoon's work completed the capital's polishing, Edwin moving over each surface with the finest stone, until the limestone achieved a smoothness that seemed impossible for material so solid, so enduring. The carved leaves now caught light and held it, glowing with internal luminosity, their curves flowing with grace that suggested actual vegetation rather than mineral permanence. He wiped the stone clean one final time, removing every trace of slurry, then stepped back to examine the completed work. The capital had fulfilled the vision he had held when first approaching the raw block, had realized the potential he had sensed in the limestone's grain and color. 4 acanthus leaves spiraled around the stone's circumference, their edges crisp, their surfaces flowing from bright highlight to deep shadow, creating dimensionality that made them appear to project further from the stone than they actually did. The undercuts captured shadow and held it, giving the carving depth that would remain effective even when the capital stood high above the chapel floor. Edwin allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction, that internal acknowledgement of work completed to the best of his ability, of skill applied with patience and care. This feeling carried no arrogance or excessive pride, merely the honest recognition that he had honored his craft, his materials, and his client's trust. The capital would serve its structural purpose while also providing beauty for generations of worshippers, and would speak of the mason's care long after his name had been forgotten. He spent the remaining daylight preparing for the next project, gathering the tools he would need for carving the ceiling bosses, examining the blocks of stone that had been delivered for that purpose, making preliminary sketches on a wooden board coated with beeswax. The sketches took form under Edwin's stylus, simple geometric patterns that would translate well to the circular bosses. Each design needed to work from multiple viewing angles, as the ceiling decorations would be seen from directly below, creating foreshortening that could distort overly complex motifs. He had learned through experience that simplicity often proved more effective than elaboration for elements positioned high above observers' heads, that bold shapes read better than fine detail at such distances. The wax board accumulated several variations of caterfoil pattern, a rosette with radiating petals, a simple foliate design that echoed the acanthus leaves he had just completed. Edwin studied each sketch, tilting the board to catch light from different angles, imagining how each would appear from the nave floor 30 feet below. The rosette pattern appealed most strongly, its symmetry providing visual stability, while its radiating elements created interest without confusion. As the afternoon light began its shift toward evening gold, Edwin set aside the sketching board and turned his attention to tool preparation. The bosses would require different chisels than the capital had demanded, as their circular form presented unique challenges. He selected several curved chisels from his collection, their edges shaped to follow circular arcs, and examined each under the waning light. Two needed sharpening, their edges showing the faint dullness that came from previous use, and he carried them to his grinding wheel. The wheel stood in the corner of the workshop, a circular stone disc mounted on a wooden frame, its lower edge resting in a trough of water. Edwin worked the treadle with his foot, setting the stone spinning, then carefully applied each chisel's edge to the wet surface. Sparks of metal and grit flew away in brief arcs, and the grinding sound filled the space with purposeful noise. He worked each edge until it achieved the sharpness he required, testing periodically against his thumbnail, feeling for that particular resistance that indicated proper keenness. When both chisels had been restored to usefulness, Edwin wiped them clean and returned them to their places among his tools. The familiar ritual of preparation brought its own satisfaction, the knowledge that tomorrow's work would begin with everything ready, that no time would be lost to inadequate equipment or insufficient planning. He swept the workshop floor one final time, gathering the day's accumulation of limestone dust and metal filings, noting how the mixture created subtle variations in color, the pale cream of stone powder, marbled through with darker traces of steel. The capital received its covering cloth for what Edwin knew would be the last time in his workshop. Tomorrow, or the day following, men would arrive to transport it to the church, where it would be installed atop its designated column, lifted into place with ropes and careful maneuvering. The thought of the capital's departure brought a faint melancholy, the inevitable sense of loss that accompanied completion. But this feeling was familiar and manageable, tempered by the knowledge that the work would live on, serving its purpose long after his involvement had ended. Evening had arrived fully by the time Edwin secured the workshop and made his way to the house. The sky had taken on that deep blue that preceded true darkness, and the first stars had appeared, faint points of light that would strengthen as night deepened. The air held a sharpness that spoke of frost returning, of another cold night that would leave its crystalline signature on stone and wood and water. He paused in the courtyard, breathing deeply, feeling the chill enter his lungs, feeling his body's warmth meet the air's coldness in that space where breath became visible mist. Inside, Beatrice had prepared a fish pottage, using dried herring that she had soaked throughout the day to remove excess salt, then simmered with turnips, onions, and barley until everything had softened into a harmonious combination. The earthenware bowls steamed as she ladled out generous portions, and the scent rose rich and savory, promising both warmth and sustenance. They ate at the table with wooden spoons, the meal's heat spreading through Edwin's chest and belly, driving away the chill he had absorbed during his final tasks in the workshop. Their conversation wandered through comfortable topic. Alice's progress on an elaborate altar cloth she had been commissioned to embroider, the preparations being made throughout the town for the approaching Advent season, the news that the miller's youngest son had decided to apprentice as a potter rather than follow his father's trade. These matters required no resolution, no urgent attention, but simply provided substance for their evening exchange, thoughts shared in the easy manner that characterized their long marriage. After supper, Edwin tended the fire, adding logs that would burn slowly through the evening hours, providing warmth and light as darkness settled completely over the town. The flames caught and spread, wrapping around the new wood, finding its grain and following it, releasing stored sunlight in the form of heat and brightness. He settled onto the bench near the hearth, feeling the day's accumulated tiredness settle into his bones, feeling his muscles begin their nightly process of repair and restoration. Beatrice joined him with her mending basket, selecting a torn hem from one of her work dresses and threading a needle by firelight. Her hands moved with practiced certainty, each stitch placed with care, creating repairs nearly invisible to casual observation. The domestic peace of the moment wrapped around Edwin like a blanket, that sense of rightness that came from simple tasks performed in comfortable companionship, from the day's work completed, and evening's rest deservedly claimed. The fire crackled and popped as pockets of moisture in the wood found the heat, each small explosion creating a brief shower of sparks that rose toward the smoke-darkened rafters before winking out. Edwin watched these miniature displays with contentment, his mind emptied of plans and concerns, simply present in the moment's quiet pleasures. His eyelids grew heavy, his breathing deepened, and he allowed himself to drift in that peaceful space where waking thoughts began dissolving into sleep's approach. When the fire had burned down to substantial coals, when the hour grew late enough that even the town's usual nighttime sounds had diminished to rare and distant murmurs, Beatrice set aside her mending and touched Edwin's arm. Together they climbed the stairs to the sleeping loft, their movements unhurried, their bodies moving through the familiar routine without need for conscious direction. The woolen blankets waited, and Edwin settled into their embrace with gratitude for warmth, for comfort, for the simple blessing of a bed shared with someone whose presence had become as essential as breathing. Through the window, stars filled the night sky in their countless thousands, their light cold and constant, unchanged by human concerns or earthly seasons. Edwin looked at them briefly before closing his eyes, thinking of the limestone that had once been countless tiny sea creatures, of time's patient work in transforming soft life into hard stone, of his own small role in shaping that stone into forms that would outlast him. The thoughts brought neither anxiety nor melancholy, only a quiet acceptance of his place in patterns larger and longer than individual existence. Sleep came gently, arriving like evening became night, a gradual transition that required no effort, no striving, only surrender to the body's need for rest and restoration. His breathing slowed and deepened, matching rhythm with Beatrice's beside him, two lives moving in parallel, sharing space and time and the deep contentment that came from days lived fully, work done well, and nights embraced with grateful peace. The capital waited in the workshop, covered and quiet, ready for its journey to the church, ready to take its place among the other stones, ready to serve its purpose for generations uncounted. And Edwin slept, his hands still bearing traces of limestone dust in their creases, his body carrying the pleasant tiredness of labor, his mind released into dreams as gentle and unhurried as the work that filled his waking hours. Morning arrived with birdsong and the gradual brightening of the sky, dawn spreading its pale light across rooftops and gardens, touching frost-covered surfaces with hints of rose and gold. Edwin woke slowly, his body reluctant to leave the warmth of blankets for the day's colder air. He lay still for a moment, listening to the town's awakening, the creak of a distant shutter, the low of a cow being led to pasture beyond the walls, the murmur of voices as neighbors greeted one another in the street. When he finally rose and dressed, the cold made his fingers clumsy with laces and fastenings, but movement brought circulation and warmth. He descended to find Beatrice already awake, the fire rebuilt and crackling, porridge bubbling gently in its pot. Steam rose from the wooden bowls she filled, and Edwin wrapped his hands around his portion, letting the heat seep into his palms before lifting the first spoonful to his lips. The grain had been enriched with dried apples, their sweetness mingling with honey, creating flavors that spoke of summer orchards and autumn harvests. After breaking their fast, Edwin made his way to the workshop, where the transported capital would remain only one more day. The church's master carpenter, Geoffrey, had sent word that he and his men would arrive tomorrow morning to collect the stone and install it in the Lady Chapel. This meant today would be devoted to beginning work on the first ceiling boss, to establishing the pattern and rhythm that would carry through the remaining pieces. The circular stone blocks for the bosses stood against the workshop's far wall, each one roughly shaped at the quarry but requiring significant refinement. Edwin selected the first, rolling it onto his workbench with effort. These pieces were heavier than they appeared, their density speaking to the limestone's quality. He studied its surface, looking for any flaws or irregularities that might affect the carving, running his hands over the rough texture, feeling the stone's character through his fingertips. Satisfied with its soundness, Edwin began the preliminary work of refining the circle's edges, ensuring perfect symmetry that would be essential once the rosette pattern was applied. He used a broad chisel and heavy mallet for this stage, removing material in deliberate strokes, pausing frequently to measure with calipers, confirming that all dimensions matched his specifications. The work was straightforward but required attention, as any deviation from true circular form would reveal itself once the decorative carving began. The morning passed in this foundational labor, the workshop filling with the familiar percussion of mallet against chisel, the drift of limestone dust through slanting sunlight, the mineral scent that Edwin had breathed for so many years it had become inseparable from the act of work itself. His hands moved through practiced patterns, his body settling into the rhythm of creation, that state where time became elastic, where hours could pass feeling like moments, where the boundary between craftsman and material seemed to blur and soften. By the time bells rang for sext, the boss's edge had achieved the refinement Edwin sought. He set down his tools and stepped back, examining the stone from multiple angles, confirming that it would accept the rosette pattern without distortion. The surface remained rough, still bearing the marks of his chisel's passage, but the underlying form was now established, providing the foundation upon which decorative elements would be built. Beatrice appeared with bread and a wedge of hard cheese, along with a jug of ale that had been kept in the coolest corner of their cellar. They sat together in the courtyard, where thin sunlight provided more brightness than warmth, the air still carrying winter's approaching chill despite the sun's presence. Edwin ate slowly, his jaw working methodically through the dense bread, his throat welcoming the ale's coolness as it washed away accumulated stone dust. A pair of crows settled on the courtyard wall, their black feathers glossy in the sunlight, their heads cocking as they regarded the humans with intelligent eyes. One called out, its voice harsh but not unpleasant, and its companion answered, the two birds conversing in their own language before taking flight again, wings beating steadily as they rose above neighboring rooftops and disappeared from view. Edwin watched them go, finding pleasure in their presence, in the way they moved through the world with such evident purpose and confidence. The afternoon's work began with marking the rosette pattern onto the boss's surface. Edwin used a piece of charcoal for this preliminary sketch, drawing the radiating petals that would eventually be carved in relief. The design needed to be centered perfectly, each petal identical in size and spacing, the whole creating a sense of balanced symmetry that would please the eye even from the nave floor far below. He worked carefully, measuring and adjusting, erasing and redrawing with a damp cloth until the pattern achieved the precision he required. Once satisfied with the layout, Edwin selected chisels appropriate for the initial carving, tools that would remove bulk material while leaving room for later refinement. He began with one petal, establishing its depth and contour, creating a template that the remaining petals would follow. The limestone responded well, cutting cleanly without crumbling, its fine grain allowing for crisp edges and smooth curves. Each strike of the mallet removed a small chip. Each chip brought the emerging form closer to realization, the accumulated effect of hundreds of small actions creating visible transformation. The work absorbed Edwin completely, narrowing his focus to the few inches where intention met material, where design became physical reality. His breathing fell into rhythm with his mallet's strikes, his body moving with the unconscious grace that came from decades of repetition, movements so deeply learned they required no conscious direction. The workshop around him faded from awareness, leaving only stone and tools and the patient unfolding of the carving process. When the bells for vespers rang, Edwin emerged from his concentration to find that two petals had been roughed out, their basic forms established, their relationship to one another determined. The remaining petals would follow more quickly now that the pattern was set, now that his hands understood the depth and angle required. He set down his tools with the reluctance that always accompanied the end of productive work, that sense of momentum interrupted, though he recognized his body's need for rest, for transition from labor to evening's gentler rhythms. The tool cleaning proceeded with its customary thoroughness, each implement receiving individual attention before being returned to its designated place. The floor was swept, the day's stone chips and dust gathered into the wooden bucket that would eventually be emptied onto the pile behind the workshop, where accumulated limestone gradually built into a pale mound, that children sometimes climbed for play. Edwin covered the boss with dampened cloth, preserving the stone's moisture content, preventing cracks that could develop in partially carved work. Before leaving, he paused beside the completed capital, lifting a corner of its covering to look once more at the acanthus leaves. They remained as beautiful as when he had finished them, their surfaces holding the day's last light, their carved details creating shadows that gave them depth and dimensionality. Tomorrow they would leave his workshop and begin their true life as architectural elements rather than independent sculptures. The thought brought that familiar mixture of satisfaction and loss, the knowledge that completion meant separation, that finished work moved beyond the maker's hands into the world's keeping. Supper that evening consisted of a thick bean pottage, made rich with a ham bone that Beatrice had been simmering since morning, its marrow and lingering meat flavoring the beans until they tasted of more than themselves. Chunks of turnip and carrot had softened into the pottage, their shapes barely holding together, their flavors mingling with the beans and ham into something greater than the sum of individual ingredients. Edwin ate with appreciation, noticing how the warmth spread through his chest, how the substantial meal satisfied hunger he hadn't fully recognized until food appeared before him. They used wooden spoons to navigate the thick mixture, and bread torn into pieces to soak up the flavorful liquid that pooled at the bottom of their bowls. After supper, Edwin walked to the church for the evening prayers, his footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestones, his breath visible in the cold air. The church's interior held its usual coolness, stone walls radiating the chill they had absorbed during daylight hours. Candles burned before the altar, their flames steady in the still air, casting golden light across the carved rood screen that separated nave from chancel. Father Benedict's voice rose in familiar Latin phrases, the words flowing in rhythmic patterns that required no understanding to appreciate, their sound alone creating a sense of peace and continuity. Edwin knelt on the worn stone floor, feeling its hardness through his woolen hose, feeling the cold seep upward through his knees. The discomfort was familiar and somehow appropriate, a small offering of bodily attention in exchange for spiritual presence. He found his mind wandering to the capital that would soon occupy its place in this building, imagining it installed above the Lady Chapel's altar, catching morning light through the east window, serving both structural and decorative purposes for generations of worshippers who would never know the mason's name. The service concluded with a final blessing, and Edwin joined the small congregation in rising, making their way toward the door where night waited. Outside, the sky had filled with stars, their number seeming to increase as his eyes adjusted to the darkness. The cold had intensified with the sun's absence, frost already forming on surfaces that would glitter silver come morning. He pulled his woolen cloak tighter and made his way home through streets grown quiet, passing shuttered windows behind which families gathered near their hearths, sharing the evening's final hours before sleep claimed them. At home, Beatrice had banked the fire and prepared the house for the night. Edwin climbed the stairs to the sleeping loft, where the day's accumulated warmth still lingered, making the space noticeably more comfortable than the hall below. He undressed and settled into bed, pulling the woolen blankets up to his chin, feeling their weight and warmth as a blessing after the evening's cold. Through the small window, he could see a slice of star-filled sky, and he watched it for a moment before closing his eyes, letting the day's tiredness pull him toward sleep. His last thoughts were of tomorrow's tasks, the capital's departure, the continued work on the first boss, the beginning of the second if time permitted. These considerations carried no anxiety, no urgency, merely the pleasant anticipation of work continuing, of skills applied, of stone transformed through patient attention. Then even these thoughts dissolved, and he drifted into sleep's quiet darkness, his breathing slow and deep, his body releasing its accumulated tension, surrendering to rest's restorative embrace. The night deepened around the town, frost spreading across every surface, stars wheeling in their ancient patterns, time continuing its patient progression while humans slept. In the workshop, both completed capital and emerging boss rested beneath their coverings, limestone holding within itself the memory of ancient seas, of countless tiny creatures whose remains had compressed over eons into stone that now served human purposes, that would continue serving long after current hands had stilled and current eyes had closed for the final time. Morning came with Geoffrey's arrival, the master carpenter accompanied by 2 apprentices and a sturdy wooden cart drawn by a placid ox. The animal's breath steamed in the cold air, and its hooves struck the cobblestones with solid, reassuring sounds. Edwin greeted them in the courtyard, then led them to the workshop where the capital waited. Together, the men lifted the stone its weight, requiring all 4 to manage safely, and carried it carefully to the cart, where they had prepared a bed of straw to cushion it during transport. Geoffrey examined the carving with the critical eye of one craftsman assessing another's work, his calloused fingers tracing the acanthus leaves' curves, feeling their depth and smoothness. He nodded slowly, his expression showing satisfaction, and spoke words of appreciation that Edwin received with quiet gratitude. The 2 men had worked together on numerous projects over the years, had developed the mutual respect that came from recognizing skill in another's trade, from understanding that buildings required the harmonious combination of multiple crafts. The cart rolled away down the street, Geoffrey walking beside the ox, his apprentices following behind to steady the capital should the cart encounter any irregularities in the road's surface. Edwin watched until they rounded a corner and passed from sight, then returned to his workshop, which seemed slightly emptier now, the space where the capital had stood creating an absence that would be filled tomorrow when he brought another boss block to his workbench. He spent the remainder of the morning continuing work on the first boss, carving the remaining petals of the rosette pattern, ensuring that each matched the established template and that the whole maintained its symmetrical balance. The work progressed smoothly, his hands moving with confidence now that the pattern was understood, now that the stone had proven cooperative and free of hidden flaws. By midday, all 8 petals existed in rough form, their basic shapes established, their spacing confirmed. Beatrice brought bread and dried fish for the midday meal, along with ale that had been flavored with ginger, its warmth spreading through Edwin's belly with pleasant intensity. They ate standing in the workshop doorway, where sunlight had finally achieved enough strength to provide modest warmth. The town's sounds filtered into their awareness, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, voices raised in conversation at the market square, the creak and rumble of carts passing on nearby streets, the bells marking the hour of sext with their bronze voices. A young boy ran past in the street beyond the courtyard, chasing a wooden hoop that rolled ahead of him, his laughter bright and unself-conscious. The sound brought a smile to Edwin's face, reminding him of his own childhood games, of days when play rather than work had filled the hours, when the future had stretched ahead unlimited and undefined. The memory held no sadness, only gentle acknowledgement of time's passage, of the natural progression from youth to age, from learning to mastery, from receiving instruction to providing it for others. The afternoon Edwin devoted to refining the rosette's petals, moving methodically from one to the next, using finer chisels to smooth surfaces and sharpen edges, creating the crisp definition that would allow the carving to read clearly from below. Each petal required the same attention, the same careful work, and he gave it without impatience, without desire to rush toward completion. The repetition held its own satisfaction, the way each petal's completion brought the whole closer to realization, the way accumulated small perfections created overall excellence. The light shifted as afternoon progressed toward evening, the sun's angle changing, shadows lengthening across the workshop floor. Edwin worked steadily through these transitions, pausing only to add charcoal to the brazier when the air grew noticeably colder, to drink water when his throat grew dry from stone dust. His hands moved with practiced certainty, his body maintaining the posture and rhythm that years had proven most sustainable, most conducive to both quality and endurance. When the bells for vespers rang across the town, Edwin had completed the refinement of 6 petals, leaving only 2 for tomorrow's attention. He straightened slowly, feeling his spine realign, feeling muscles that had been held in sustained positions begin to release. The boss was taking shape beautifully, the rosette pattern emerging from the limestone with clarity and grace, each petal distinct yet harmonious with its neighbors, the whole creating a sense of ordered beauty that would serve the church's ceiling well. He performed his evening ritual of tool care, wiping each chisel clean, checking edges for any damage that might require attention, returning everything to its proper place with the methodical thoroughness that prevented future problems. The floor received its nightly sweeping, the accumulated stone dust and chips gathered and removed, leaving the workspace prepared for tomorrow's continuation. These actions required no conscious thought, his body moving through them with the ease of long habit, finding in their repetition a kind of comfort, a sense of rightness and completion. Before covering the boss, Edwin dampened his cloth and wiped the carved surfaces, removing the finest dust that might otherwise settle into details and diminish their crispness. The wet stone revealed subtle color variations he hadn't noticed when dry streaks of slightly darker cream, tiny fossils embedded in the matrix, speaking to the limestone's ancient origins beneath vanished seas. He traced one of these fossils with his fingertip, feeling its different texture, marveling at how something that had once been alive and swimming could become stone, could serve human purposes millions of years after its death. The evening air had grown sharp with cold as Edwin secured the workshop and crossed the courtyard to the house. Stars were already visible in the deepening blue of the sky, appearing one by one as darkness claimed dominion from the fading day. The scent of wood smoke hung heavy in the still air, every household's hearth sending its contribution upward, the combined effect creating a haze that softened the edges of buildings and blurred the boundaries between earth and sky. Inside, warmth and firelight welcomed him. Beatrice had prepared a vegetable pottage thickened with oats, its surface steaming, its scent promising comfort and sustenance. They ate together at the wooden table, the food's warmth spreading through Edwin's body, driving away the chill he had absorbed during the day's final hours in the workshop. Chunks of yesterday's bread, toasted near the fire until crisp, provided contrast to the pottage's softness, and Edwin found satisfaction in the interplay of textures, the way simple foods combined to create a meal that nourished both body and spirit. Their conversation touched on small matters, the need to visit the chandler before tallow candles grew scarce in the approach to winter, news that their neighbor's daughter would marry in spring, the observation that the apple tree in their small garden would require pruning before it leafed out again. These topics required no decisions, no urgent action, but simply provided substance for their evening exchange. Thoughts shared in the comfortable manner of two people who had spent years learning each other's rhythms and preferences. After supper, Edwin sat near the fire with a cup of ale warmed with a hot poker, the liquid steaming gently, its slight bitterness mellowed by the heat. His body carried the pleasant heaviness that came from honest labor, muscles relaxed and loose, mind emptied of the day's focused concentration. He watched flames dance across the logs, finding in their constant movement a kind of hypnotic peace, his breathing deepening, his eyelids growing heavy with approaching sleep. Beatrice settled beside him with her spinning, the wool flowing through her capable fingers with practiced ease, the spindle turning with smooth regularity. The rhythmic motion created its own quiet music, a whisper of fiber against fiber, the occasional soft click as the spindle touched the floor before being caught and sent spinning again. Edwin found the sound soothing, one more element in the evening's peaceful composition, contributing to the general sense of contentment that filled their modest hall. The fire burned lower as the evening progressed, its flames diminishing to glowing coals that pulsed with internal heat, occasionally sending up brief flares when pockets of resin in the wood found the fire. The warmth it provided remained constant even as visible flames decreased, radiating outward into the room, holding back the night's cold. Edwin shifted on the bench, finding a more comfortable position, allowing his body to sink deeper into relaxation, releasing the last vestiges of the day's physical engagement. Eventually, Beatrice set aside her spindle and touched Edwin's arm, the gesture gentle and familiar, signaling that the hour had grown late enough for bed. Together, they performed the evening's final tasks, banking the fire with careful attention, ensuring it would maintain sufficient heat to ease morning's rekindling, checking that the door was secured, extinguishing all lights except the single rushlight that would burn through the night's darkness. The routine unfolded without need for discussion, each knowing their role, each moving through the familiar sequence with practiced efficiency. The sleeping loft held the day's accumulated warmth, making it noticeably more comfortable than the hall below where cold air had begun settling. Edwin undressed and slipped beneath the woolen blankets, feeling their weight and warmth as blessing, as protection against the night's chill. Through the small window, stars filled the sky in countless numbers, their light cold and distant but somehow comforting in its constancy, its reminder that some things remained unchanged despite human concerns and earthly seasons. Beatrice settled beside him, and they lay in comfortable silence, neither feeling need for words, both simply present in the moment's peace. Edwin reached out to take her hand, feeling her fingers intertwine with his, the small gesture of connection and affection requiring no elaboration, complete in itself. Her breathing gradually slowed and deepened, signaling her drift towards sleep, and Edwin followed, his own awareness beginning to blur and soften, consciousness giving way to rest's approach. His last waking thoughts touched on tomorrow's work, completing the final 2 petals, beginning the detailed refinement that would bring the rosette to its finished state, perhaps starting on the second boss if time allowed. These considerations carried no weight, no urgency, merely the gentle anticipation of work continuing, of skills applied with patience, of stone transformed through careful attention. Then even these thoughts dissolved, and he drifted into sleep's embrace, his breathing slow and regular, his body releasing its accumulated tension, surrendering completely to rest. The night deepened over Ashford, frost forming intricate patterns on every exposed surface, stars wheeling through their ancient paths, the world continuing its patient turning while humans slept. In the workshop, the partially completed boss rested beneath its covering, limestone holding within itself the memory of ancient seas, waiting for tomorrow's continuation of the transformation that would give it purpose and beauty, that would allow it to serve the church and its community for generations beyond counting. Morning arrived with gradual brightening, the sky shifting from black to deep blue to pale gray as dawn approached. Edwin woke to the sound of bells ringing for lauds, their bronze voices carrying across rooftops and through narrow streets, calling the faithful to prayer even as most of the town still slept. He lay still for a moment, allowing consciousness to return fully, feeling the warmth of blankets against the room's chill, hearing Beatrice's steady breathing beside him, aware of his body's readiness for another day of work. He dressed in the loft's relative warmth, then descended to find the fire reduced to buried embers that needed coaxing back to flame. Edwin added kindling carefully, blowing gently to encourage the hidden heat, watching as small flames appeared and grew, reaching upward to claim the larger pieces of wood he added once the fire had established itself. The warmth spread gradually through the hall, and by the time Beatrice descended, the worst of the morning's cold had been driven back. Porridge bubbled gently over the rebuilt fire, and they broke their fast standing near the hearth, the hot grain warming them from within while flames warmed them from without. Edwin ate with appreciation, noticing the sweetness of honey mixed through the porridge, the chewy texture of dried currants that Beatrice had added, finding in these simple flavors a quiet satisfaction that prepared him for the day ahead. Through the small window, He could see frost glittering on the courtyard's flagstones, transforming familiar surfaces into something crystalline and strange, beautiful in its temporary decoration. The workshop received him with its customary mineral breath, the air cold enough that his first exhalations emerged as visible mist. Edwin stirred the brazier's embers and added charcoal, watching as small flames appeared and began their patient work of spreading warmth through the space. While waiting for the chill to ease, he uncovered the boss and examined yesterday's work in the morning's clear light, which entered the doorway at a low angle, emphasizing every carved detail with sharp precision. The 6 completed petals maintained their quality, showing no cracks or unexpected changes from settling. Edwin traced their curves with his fingertips, confirming through touch what his eyes had already told him: the work was sound, ready for today's completion. He selected the chisels he would need for the remaining 2 petals, arranging them in order on the workbench, preparing everything so that once he began, no interruption for tool selection would break his concentration. The 7th petal took shape under his hands with the confidence that came from having carved its 6 predecessors, his movements assured, his judgment certain about depth and angle and proportion. The mallet's strikes fell in steady rhythm, each one removing a small chip of limestone, each chip bringing the emerging form closer to completion. Stone dust drifted through the morning light, creating momentary patterns that appeared and vanished, and the workshop filled with the familiar percussion that had become the soundtrack to Edwin's working life. By the time the bells rang for terce, both remaining petals existed in rough form, their basic shapes established, their relationship to the completed petals confirmed. Edwin stepped back to examine the whole, tilting his head to view the rosette from different angles, ensuring that the pattern maintained its symmetry, that no petal stood out as inconsistent with its neighbors. Satisfied, he set down his heavy mallet and selected lighter tools for the refinement work that would occupy the remainder of the morning. The detailed work required complete focus, Edwin moving from petal to petal with fine chisels, smoothing surfaces, sharpening edges, creating the crisp definition that would allow the carving to project clearly when viewed from below. His breathing fell into rhythm with the work, shallow and regular, his body held in the particular posture that years had proven most effective for sustained precision. The world narrowed to the few inches where chisel met stone, where intention became physical reality through accumulated small actions. Beatrice's appearance in the doorway pulled him gently from this absorbed state. She carried bread and cheese, along with a wooden cup of small beer, setting them on a clear section of the workbench without interrupting his work. Edwin nodded his thanks and continued for another few minutes, finishing the petal currently under his attention before setting down his tools and turning to the offered meal. His hands trembled slightly from sustained fine motor control, and he flexed his fingers several times before picking up the bread, working feeling back into joints that had been held in precise positions for extended periods. They ate together in the courtyard, where thin sunlight provided brightness without substantial warmth. The bread was dense and satisfying, made from rye flour that gave it a darker color and earthier flavor than wheat bread. The cheese was sharp and crumbly, aged long enough to develop complexity, and together with the beer, The simple meal provided exactly what Edwin's body required: sustenance without heaviness, nourishment without excess. A neighbor's dog wandered into the courtyard, a brown hound with gentle eyes and graying muzzle, its tail wagging in hopeful expectation. Edwin broke off a piece of bread crust and offered it, watching the animal take it delicately between its teeth before settling nearby to chew with evident contentment. The dog's presence brought a smile to his face, its simple pleasure in a bread crust reminding him that satisfaction often came from modest gifts, from small kindnesses freely given and gratefully received. The afternoon found Edwin completing the rosette's refinement, working methodically around the circle one final time, ensuring that every surface achieved the smoothness he required, that every edge possessed the crispness necessary for the pattern to read clearly from a distance. The work demanded patience and attention, as any lapse in concentration could result in a slip that damaged hours of previous effort. He maintained his focus through force of habit, through years of training that had made such sustained attention feel natural rather than effortful. When the last petal had received its final refinement, Edwin began the polishing process that would complete the boss. He selected his coarsest smoothing stone and dampened it with water, then began working it across the carved surfaces in small circular motions. The friction created that familiar soft grinding sound, peaceful in its rhythmic regularity, and limestone slurry formed beneath the stone's passage, which Edwin periodically wiped away to assess his progress. The polishing proceeded through its stages: coarse to medium to fine each pass, removing smaller imperfections, bringing the stone's surface closer to the lustrous smoothness that would make it seem almost to glow when catching light. Edwin's shoulders began to ache from the sustained circular motions, but he continued without pause, knowing that stopping mid-process could create inconsistencies in finish that would reveal themselves once the boss was installed. By the time shadows began lengthening across the courtyard, the rosette had achieved its completed state. The limestone glowed with internal luminosity, the carved petals seeming to radiate from the boss's center with graceful regularity, their surfaces flowing from bright highlight to deep shadow in ways that gave dimensionality to what was actually shallow relief. Edwin wiped the stone clean one final time, removing every trace of slurry, then stepped back to examine his work with the satisfaction of completion, a vision realized through patient application of skill. He allowed himself a moment of quiet appreciation, studying the way light played across the carved surfaces, imagining how the boss would appear when installed in the church's ceiling, how it would catch and reflect the glow of candles during evening services, and how its pattern would contribute to the overall harmony of the building's decoration. The thought brought deep contentment, that sense of purpose fulfilled, of work serving something larger than individual ambition or personal gain. The tool cleaning that evening carried additional thoroughness, as Edwin knew tomorrow would bring the beginning of the second boss, requiring fresh tools and renewed attention. Each chisel received careful examination, each edge tested and found either satisfactory or marked for sharpening, each handle wiped clean of accumulated oil and dust. The smoothing stones were scrubbed free of limestone residue and set aside to dry, ready for their next use. The workshop floor received its nightly sweeping, The day's debris gathered and removed, leaving the space ordered and prepared. Before covering the completed boss, Edwin dampened a cloth and wiped its surfaces once more, ensuring that no dust had settled during the final hours of work. The wet stone revealed its full beauty, colors deepening, details sharpening, the whole taking on a richness that dry stone could only suggest. He stood looking at it for a long moment, committing its appearance to memory, knowing that once it left his workshop for installation, he might never see it again at close range, might never again be able to trace its details with his fingers or study it in changing light. Supper that evening was a bean pottage enriched with bacon, the meat's saltiness and fat flavoring the beans until they tasted luxurious despite their humble origins. Beatrice had added winter herbs from her garden thyme and sage, their earthy flavors complementing the bacon and beans in satisfying harmony. They ate with wooden spoons, soaking up the thick liquid with bread, the meal's warmth and substance exactly suited to the cold evening and the day's physical labor. After eating, Edwin sat by the fire with warmed ale, watching flames consume logs in their beautiful, destructive dance. His body carried the pleasant tiredness that came from work completed well, from goals achieved through sustained effort, from skills exercised to their fullest. His mind drifted peacefully, touching on memories and observations without settling on any single thought, simply moving through consciousness like wind through reeds, present but undemanding. Beatrice joined him with her mending, and they sat in comfortable companionship as the evening deepened around them, as the fire burned lower, as the day released its hold and allowed night to claim its place. The domestic peace of the moment wrapped around Edwin like the woolen blankets that would soon warm his sleep, and he found himself grateful for the simple blessings that filled his life work, that engaged his skills, a home that provided shelter, a companion who shared his days, and the deep contentment that came from living in harmony with the rhythms that had sustained craftsmen for generations beyond counting.